And you're on.
Hello, everybody. I'm here today giving a little talk on the evidence for Scythian archery. And for those who don't know what a Scythian is, I'll just spend 1 minute on that. These were nomad peoples of the Iron Age of Eurasia, of the grasslands. They were pastoralists, mainly cattle, but also sheep and donkeys, horses, even camels out east. And the grasslands extended from approximately near the Pontic Steppes above the Black Sea, all the way into Mongolia and parts of Siberia. And we call these people Scythians. If you go far past the Caspian Sea, they're usually referred to as Saka. These are Greek terms. These people did not have a written language except far out in the western desert of China today. So what we know about them historically is through their, mainly the Greeks and their other enemies. So the first millennium BC would be from about 1000 BC, but the main focus of the Scythian culture comes into play around 500 BC to approximately 200 BC. It'd be their classic period. And one of the main evidences we have from them is from Herodotus, who was the father of history. He's a Greek speaking in the or writing in the 5th century BC. And book 4 explains pretty extensively about the Scythians. They were the immediate neighbors of the Greeks, and they were totally diametrically opposed in almost every way you can think of to the Greeks. So they were both friends and enemies. The Greeks kept Scythians as slaves and trading partners, and the reverse was also true. The Scythians kept Greeks as slaves and stuff. So that's one of our main sources. And it also speaks to archery. Archery was the main tool of the Scythians. Let me bring this down a little bit. Was the main tool of the Scythians. And the Greeks represented these peoples very well in what's called Attic wares, which are red and black wares. And I think pretty highly of Attic wares because they show things that are found archaeologically about the Scythians. Clothing, styles, the quiver, it's a quiver combination usually called a goritus, which in the west, near the Black Sea, was a very heavy piece of like luggage that carried both the bow and a quiver with many arrows. And there's just hundreds of these illustrations of Scythians. You can always tell by their garb. Usually Greeks are shown, but also the Greeks' enemies are shown. And here's a Scythian with one of their favorite hand tools, not a sword, but a dagger axe, which would penetrate armor if the enemy was wearing a helmet. But also their bows. You see the bows are not of great size. These bows are extremely strong, but short, and they fit in this goritus right here. You can see this edge is like the shape of the bow with the string on this side. This is another one. This is one of my favorite ones. This is Eubolos. This is a made-up Greek name because they often put the names of the person. If it was Hercules, they would have Heracles here or whatever. But this is a Scythian. And he's kind of a hybrid. They've got him shown naked, fighting naked, which the Greeks like to depict each other fighting naked. I don't think that's actually true, but they depict it that way, carrying a shield. And he has this very unusual bow we'll show you some more of. And here's his quiver in the back. And here's his Scythian hat, very typical. I really like this one. Most of the images are from Greeks, but what's rare is to find a Scythian work in which they depict themselves. And here's two men hunting a wild boar. And this man has a typical Scythian bow with the hooks that are very typical to their bows. See, he's shooting an arrow down at the boar. This man's standing in a tree, getting out of the way. Poor horse doesn't have the same option, but he has that same kind of bow that Eubolos has, which are very unusual and not depicted very often. So gold works are one of the other major sources for information on Scythian archery. And I shouldn't say just gold works, but metal works of all kind. And so once again, most of what we see is from the Greek world. And even though these are found in Scythian graves, the quality of the work and the perspective and certain artistic conventions lead art scholars to say that this is a Greek work. If it was a Scythian, then he was a Greek-trained Scythian who did this work. But mostly the Greeks were trading with the Scythians and they did this work. And it shows this man with the Scythian bow. It has the typical hooks on it, and he's aiming at this man's face. And I think this is a common theme among the Scythians because the men wore heavy clothing for the cold and whatnot. This might actually be some kind of a leather jacket he's wearing, and the arrow would not penetrate well, but the faces, they never protected their faces. So here he's shown aiming at this other man's face. And here he's got this Greek style gorytus. The bow would extend out the top. We'll see that. Here's two blood brothers. This is a gold work, also from Western Scythia, from the Black Sea area. These men had taken a vow to protect each other for the rest of their lives. And here they are with their bows. The bows are not complete, but you can see they had a hook on both ends originally. And the holes show that it was riveted probably to a piece of leather. So this would probably be a belt, a plaque, or it could be a harness. But considering it being in gold, more likely, let's say, a belt plaque. Shows the bows are not of great stature. And other artworks do show this more completely. This is a drawing from a gold work of Western Scythia. It shows the bow just barely extending from the top of here. And as this tapers toward the bottom, this shows that the bow was asymmetric, because if it were the same size at the top as the bottom, this would have to be parallel. So here it is, and here's your quiver with the arrows. And these were variously decorated. Gorytus, combination quiver and bow case of the Scythians. There's another one. This one's in the Hermitage, gold work from that same area, Black Sea area, Pontic Steppes, I guess, with the man stringing the bow. The bows are very hard to string, and it shows this man doing that, just that, by winding it among his knees. So the Soviets, during the Soviet era, dug approximately 2,000 kurgans. One of the attributes of Scythians is that their kings were often buried in immense burial mounds and tumulus with the grave all the way at the bottom. And inside there were clothes, were gold, were all kinds of weapons. Sometimes women followed their men into the grave. Horses, I mean, there's Scythian graves with dozens of horses in there. And everything you can imagine, but the least common thing to be found in a Scythian grave was a bow. And here's some remains that come from Western Scythia, Russia, and mostly Ukraine. And you see they have the classic shape, but there's not enough left of them to tell how they were made. And those of us who are experimental bow makers, are always wondering, well, how are these bows made? You can see by the curve that they cannot be a single piece of wood. You cannot get a single piece of wood into this shape. except maybe for decorative purposes somehow. And then it wouldn't really make a bow. So this is, probably a composite bow, which is wood, horn, and sinew. But how it's constructed, there's 100 different ways to construct a composite bow. And this one are supposedly made of oak, which leads me, oak is not a bow making material. There's much better materials even in that area to make a bow out of. So I have concluded that these are most likely of funerary objects, which were replica bows that were put in the grave to complete, the grave equipment. I want to say that a lot of Soviet writers wrote about Scythian bows. Litvinsky, Rudenko, Medvedev, Vasilev, and others wrote extensively on Scythian archery. And I've had linguists translate every one of those texts that I could find, and none of them tells you how the bow is constructed. So it's kind of humorous to read somebody's multi-page description on their bows when they actually don't know how they're made. And a friend of mine, Vladimir Karesiev, who's a professor of archaeology in Tashkent, retired, offers this gold work as an explanation of why the Western Scythians did not put bows in their grave. Because according to Herodotus, Hercules, who might be represented here, had 3 sons. And he said, whoever can string my bow and shoot it will be my successor. And it turned out of the 3 sons, only the youngest, when he grew up, could actually string and shoot the father's bow. He was the only one who was strong enough and knew how to shoot the bow. You could not be a king in antiquity if you didn't know how to shoot a bow. That's, in many places, this is lauded greatly of how the king was such a great archer. So here it is, the old bearded man is handing the bow to the young, clean-shaven man. So according to Karesiev, he is signing off that the younger man should now be king, because Hercules then banished the 2 older sons to leave the country and leave it to the younger son. So the Scythians didn't have crowns. They don't find crowns hardly ever, except some big fancy contrivances for women in Scythian graves. And so they couldn't bury the bow. The bow was inherited by the son, and it was his symbol of authority. Here's King Attius, who, if I'm saying that correctly, who is a Scythian king. It shows him with his bow, and it shows that he's an archer. Here's his Gorytus. He's on horseback. So, a coin has 2 sides. So you can show the deity on one side, and you can show the king shooting the bow on the other. These are extremely common in antiquity from, all kind of places to show the king being an archer. Here he is with a typical Scythian bow. Now, as we move east, this is actually from probably southern Siberia. You find gold works which are not Greek influenced. And these ones I find extremely precious for investigating, because the Greeks were depicting another people when they're doing Scythian gold work. This one is a Scythian, or probably more likely a Saka, depicting this scene themselves. And I've heard this interpreted that these 2 men here and here were out riding when this man receives a fatal wound. And the 2 of them travel along until they get to the tree of life, sort of a metaphorical thing. And under the tree of life is the Earth Mother. You can see she has a headdress that's so tall it reaches to the very top of the tree of life. And he lays down in her arms and dies. Before he dies, he hangs his Gorytus with his bow and arrows onto the tree of life. A little sad, a very good story. There's actually two of these. There's a right and a left. So sometimes they're depicted one or the other. It's very confusing when you see it that way. But anyway, you can see he's not embracing her as a lover would. He's embracing her. He's trying to hold her hand, and in his death, he embraces the Mother Earth. I love this piece. It also shows the correct method of hanging an Eastern Gorytus was from these two suspension points, and it has a tab here. And apparently this doesn't have anything to do with supporting it. It's below the point of balance of this one. So I believe that this is the most authentic. Also underneath here is often a wood slat. And so you're going through the leather and grabbing that long wood slat that supports the Gorytus. Here's one of those Eastern Gorytus. This comes from Xinjiang, which is our main source on construction of Scythian bows, one of the driest deserts in the world. And people there are buried commonly with their bows and arrows. And I take this to mean that they are not royal persons, that they are everyday persons. Now, if you put a person in the ground in Ukraine or Siberia or Russia, the chances are that this will completely disintegrate, because archery is basically a biological sort of artifact. The bows are made of wood, horn, and sinew, and a lot of glue. All those are biodegradable. The quiver is, the arrows. This will all degrade until all that's left is some bronze arrowheads. And here's that pennant at the bottom. So this is a very important artifact. And underneath right here is a slat of wood that goes up and down. And what I think is interesting is right here is the exact curve of an unstrung double curve bow, with the hook being right here and the upper hook being right here. So unlike the Western Gorytus, which was cut off at about right here, and the bow having the top projecting from the top of the quiver, in this case, the top of the bow, the head, is buried inside the Gorytus. And this has 3 quivers. So one can imagine taking arrows, which would be totally encompassed into this quiver. And when the action seemed imminent, you could take them out and sort them right here. A lot of times in antiquity, other quivers are sort of like a toolkit. You have different kinds of arrows there with different kinds of points for different purposes. And so you could sort your arrows here for quick action with the fletching and the nocks extending. So this is in the museum in Urumqi, Xinjiang, what is today China. We can learn a lot also about Scythian archery from their arrow points. This is a collection was collected by a man in Afghanistan and brought to my hometown. And he collected all these at the market in Mazar-e-Sharif. Now farmers and like that, travelers would find these. They're made of bronze and they almost never disintegrate totally. And you can learn a lot. These are from the actual Bronze Age, which was the 2nd millennium BC. And I think it's kind of interesting that these are from the Neolithic, and they're about the same size and even the same shape as Iron Age, classic Scythian. Some of them have a barb on it, which brings people to the conclusion that these might have been poisoned arrows. A lot of them, because of the scale of the point, the arrow would have been of a larger diameter, but it was sharpened down like a pencil and put into the socket in the base. So it appears that some Scythians relied on their arrows as being harpoon-like, where the arrow would either break off or disengage if you tried to remove it. And if it were poisoned or made dirty or whatever, their poisons are very well-known formulas and stuff. It would increase the likelihood that the next day or several days later, the person would either die of shock or die of some blood poisoning kind of thing. They learn a lot from Scythian bronze arrowheads. There's a million of these to be found. There's battle sites where they find hundreds at one single site. And also, they're very good indicators that it was the Scythians who attacked various fortresses. They find fortress sites where these are on the outside and around the gates and stuff. You learn a lot from the arrowheads. This is a bow. It came from the Silk Road Museum in Seoul, South Korea. And this is a very classic and in very good condition bow. And it was on display there. And this was taken later. The museum went out of business, and this bow actually was sold. And this is the stiffener for the quiver bow case, the Goritus. You can see it's a giant slat of wood. Part of the leather is still sticking here to the wood slat. And it even has parts of the original string, which are very interesting. And these are twisted rawhide strings. And back of me are some of my reproductions, and I've made those strings, and they're most easily made with the thin rawhide from the belly of a deer, a multi-strand twisted. And that way, if there's some small flaw on a piece of rawhide, then it sort of averages out over the string. And you twist these together and put a large weight on them while they're drying, and it holds it into a very nice position. You pre-stretch the string. This is one that toured in Europe. This is the Tsubishi bow, and it's highly asymmetrical. And the only place where bows like this are found anymore is in Xinjiang, China. A lot of those areas are in salt flats, and even if it has soil, if you dig down a couple feet, you'll get into solid salt deposits. So if you put a body, the bodies are famous for having come back as mummies. If they were buried in the winter, then the people would actually freeze dry, and they still have their hair on them. They still have all their original clothing. They're often buried in the bed in which they died. The bed is buried too, and all their gear, including their bows and arrows. In that area, every single burial contains a bow and arrow. And I chalk this up to them not being royalty. So there was nobody to collect their territory because they had no territory. They were nomadic. The king was buried somewhere else. You can see the various arrows. This one with a wood barb on it, and a bone point, and some other point, probably metal. And typical in the West, the arrows were very short. We've noticed that the Goritus, some of them couldn't have an arrow more than 20 or 22 inches, something like that. But here in the East, these arrows are what we call full size, full draw arrows, and let's say 28 inches. Stephen Selby also noticed that some of them might have been as long as 31 inches. Not sure how common all that is. So at any rate, on the East, you see the attributes of the bow are that the unstrung, well, this is actually in the shape of a strung bow because it was put in the grave strung, but the tips actually point toward each other. It's highly asymmetric. This is one of the most asymmetric Scythian bows I've ever found, is the Tsubishi bow. And the lower limb has a very hard 90-degree bend in it. And this is because these two limbs are actually the same, but you're holding the bow somewhere in this area. And so this curve has to be more greatly compressed than the upper one. Very interesting bow, toured Europe. And now we're getting to the real meat of this. These are the Yanghai bows. If you want to find out more about these bows, they were reported on in ATARN, the Asian Traditional Archery Research Network, now on Facebook. And these are archived, and Stephen Selby actually spent a day and a night at this museum, and he was allowed to photograph these few bows. And he said there were hundreds in the museum's collection, and he found some that were even more disintegrated than this, that he could actually look into and see exactly how they were constructed. And he makes numerous pages of notes on their exact construction, which is extremely novel. And it really caught the experimental bow making world by surprise. And we have a lot to thank for Stephen Selby doing this. He's a museum type and a university professor and intellectual, and he promotes Chinese archery. And since these were found in Xinjiang, they would be considered Chinese. They call them Yanghai bows. We don't know exactly who to include in the Scythian world. And it should be noted that other people other than Scythians used these very iconic type bows. You had Persians and Medians and Parthians. You had the Greeks themselves, and probably just dozens and dozens of other cultures who use these bows that we identify as Scythian bows. And a Scythian is not an exact type of person. It simply shows a political and a lifestyle of nomadism. So at any rate, a lot of people get included into Scythia that we don't know exactly about. So I want to recap. Western Scythia in the Black Sea region, the types of bows you have are asymmetric bows, short, symmetric bows. The Greeks tend to prefer, for their own use, symmetric bows, which makes me think that the Greeks were actually making some of these bows themselves. We don't have any evidence for that, unfortunately. There are some bows, like the first couple slides showed, a bow with no hooks on them. This is kind of unusual and not typical, but not unheard of or unknown either. And then you have this Siberian type, which is more angular and also has no hooks on it. You can see there's a reproduction of that right over here. Then Eastern Scythian bows, these are typical of all the Yanghai, Tsubishi bows. They're actually a bit longer than the Western bows. You get a longer draw, and the bow will not fit into a Western Scythian Goritus. So they are different. Okay, I think I was the first person to publish on this in, I think, 2009, maybe. That was about 4 years after Stephen Selby first published on the construction of the Eastern Scythian bows. Then it became apparent to me that the construction was extremely similar, I think undeniably so, with composite bows found in the Tutankhamun grave. And Tutankhamun was buried with 32 bows, as I recall, 32 composite bows, horn, wood, sinew bows. And so the dark shows the horn, this diagonal lines show wood grain, and then all the way at the bottom, the dotted shows the sinew being on the back of the bow, the horn here being on the belly. But they have these side plates, like the bow wasn't wide enough, and so they were going to add some wood to it. And these also have that same type of construction, very unusual. And also to have a strip of horn down the center of the core. So the Egyptians say that it was the Hyksos who brought these composite bows into Egypt. We don't know who the Hyksos were. Nobody, you can Google it and you can research, and they're not sure where they came from, but probably Asians. And they brought this bow in from who knows where, much earlier, actually, almost 1,000 years before Scythian bows. There's also a dig that happened in Siberia, and a young man named Michael Biddle was at that dig, and it had a bow, one bow, which was laminated together in this manner, quite like a Eastern Scythian bow, but no horn and no sinew. Well, the sinew could have worn away, but the horn might have still been there, or there would be a space here for it. So a lot of people have concluded that this was a funerary bow. Also, his bow had knots in it. Now, no bow maker will intentionally include knots in a composite bow. They're very fatal to a bow. So this layered kind of construction was considered to be for funerary objects, but it does have these side slats on here, very unusual, hard to figure out for the people who like analyzing the construction of these bows. And this is an illustration from a Kazakh book, and it shows that instead of the tip being made of horn, wood, and sinew, that the tip is made out of one piece of bent wood, which makes a lot more sense. Maybe the people out in the desert of China didn't have large pieces of wood, and so they were taking little sticks and putting them together. But here it shows in the artist idea is that the hook on the end of the bow is then put between other layers. And so maybe that Olan Kurengal laminated construction, layered construction, would be typical of, let's say, the Western Scythian. We just don't know. I also have to say that of the Yanghai bows, the 5 bows that Stephen investigated, no 2 are exactly equal in construction. It was sort of a construction technique rather than a philosophy rather than an exact formula. The arrows, you see the arrowheads are often not of great size. This came from Xinjiang, but I'm not sure what the period is. This is very interesting. There's also an Arzon grave in Siberia that had some nice cresting, some dots and decorations. And his points were made out of iron, which even in the Iron Age was rare enough that it was only reserved for usually knives and swords. All the points were made of bronze, but his iron points then have inlaid gold in them. Those are very unusual, and I don't know of any others outside that site. So you're shooting gold at an enemy, doesn't make a lot of sense. And here's me shooting one of my reproductions. It's this reproduction right here. And any rate, really enjoyed reproducing these bows. And there it is.